He called her a tradeswoman fit only for needlework, in front of the whole assembly room. 2 months later, the same duke who mocked her was begging at her counting-house door, his entire fortune one storm away from ruin. She held his future in her ledger. He held her heart without knowing it yet. By autumn, one of them would have to admit who'd been right all along. Marlow Cross, September 1817. By the time the leaves turned, every soul in the harbour district would know that the Duke of Rosemere owed his fortune to a woman in trade. None of them knew it yet, not even the Duke. The Pell counting house opened its shutters at 7 each morning, rain or otherwise, and Catherine Pell was always the first one through the door. She liked the hour before the clerks arrived, the quiet, the smell of ink and tallow, the ledger open on the desk like a conversation that had been waiting all night to continue. "You'll ruin your eyes reading by candlelight," Thomas said, dropping into the chair across from her with the particular sourness of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. "I read by window light. The candles for you, since you came down before the sun did for once. Norris called again yesterday, while you were at the warehouse." Thomas turned a paperweight over in his hands, not looking at her. "His father's raised the offer. 11,000 all told, plus he'll keep the name on the door if it matters to you." "It matters that the name on the door means something, not that it's merely there." She didn't look up from the page. "Tell him no again, the same way you told him no in June." "I didn't tell him no in June, I told him I'd think on it." He set the paperweight down harder than he needed to. £11,000, Catherine. We could both be free of this place. You could live as grandfather's granddaughter ought to, instead of minding ships for the rest of your life. I could stop being reminded every time we're introduced that the name Pell means warehouses now and not a baronetcy. You could also learn to enjoy being right about a cargo manifest, which is a finer feeling than you give it credit for. She finally looked up. "Father built this from nothing, Thomas. I won't be the one who sells it merely because some of the better drawing rooms still wrinkle their noses at us minding it ourselves. They wrinkle their noses regardless of whether we sell. It's not our birth they object to. It's that we still bother working at all when we needn't." He stood. "I'm dressing for the assembly tonight. You ought to come. It would do you good to be looked at as something other than a woman who corrects men's figures." "I enjoy correcting men's figures. It's the one entertainment this town reliably provides." He left without answering that, which she counted not for the first time as a small victory. The clerks arrived within the hour, and with them the ordinary business of the day. A manifest from a ship out of Lisbon, a query from a wine merchant in Bath, a junior clerk named Hobbs, who could add a column faster than any man in the building and still asked Catherine to check his sums twice before he'd trust them. She liked the rhythm of it. 6 years in, the room still steadied her. Every figure either balanced or didn't, and no man's opinion outweighed an honest total. Her father had built the house on exactly that principle. James Pell had been a baronet's second son, raised to inherit nothing and expected to make a respectable, ornamental marriage instead, and had chosen tea crates and shipping manifests over a life spent waiting politely for his brother to die. It cost him nothing in name. Pell remained a gentleman's name, whatever ledgers he kept, but it cost him standing among relations who found a man actively minding trade considerably more embarrassing than a man quietly poor. Catherine had spent most of her life deciding that particular embarrassment was theirs to keep, not hers to inherit. "Mrs. Bray's note came for you," Hobbs said, setting it on her desk near midday. "About tonight." Catherine read it, smiled briefly and set it aside. She had half a mind not to go at all. Assemblies were rarely worth the trouble of a good gown, but Louisa would only come and fetch her in person if she stayed home, and that was, on balance, more trouble than simply attending. The assembly room above the customs hall held perhaps 30 people that night, candle smoke thickening above their heads, and one conversation that would matter more than any of them yet understood. Catherine stood near the window with her friend Mrs. Louisa Bray, a glass of lemonade in hand she had no intention of finishing, listening to 3 gentlemen discuss a shipping venture with the confidence of men who had never once read a bill of lading. A 4th man stood at the edge of the same small group, unintroduced, listening more than he spoke, which she took at the time for simple reserve. "The Bristol Consortium will double their money by spring," said Edward Norris. "Everyone says so." "Everyone is wrong," Catherine said. Louisa's eyebrows rose. "Catherine." "It's true, though." The men had already turned. She had spoken at an ordinary pitch, the pitch of a small group standing close enough to hear each other over the music, and she found, the words being out, that she didn't regret them. The consortium overextended on insurance last quarter. Lloyd's raised their rates in July. Anyone buying shares now is buying at the top of a market already turning. And how would Miss Pell know Lloyd's rates better than the men who set them? Norris asked, more wounded than hostile. Because I read the notices, instead of trusting that everyone agreeing with each other makes them correct. The unintroduced man laughed, short, startled, quickly swallowed. She glanced at him properly for the first time. Tall, dark-haired, dressed with the plainness wealthy men affected when they wanted you to know they didn't need to try. She didn't need an introduction to know what he was once she looked. The small group itself had already told her, the way the other three men had angled themselves toward him from the start, the way Norris had been performing as much for him as for her. "Forgive me," he said, not sounding especially sorry. "Is this Miss Pell of the trading house?" "It is." I confess I hadn't expected a lecture on marine insurance at an autumn assembly. His mouth curved, amused at his own joke before he'd quite finished making it. "Shouldn't you be home with your needlework, Miss Pell, rather than minding men's business?" Norris laughed, relieved to have so grand an ally. Catherine looked at the Duke, for that was unmistakably what he was now, the small group's attention settling on him like a compass finding north, and said nothing at all for 3 long seconds. "I don't knit," she said. "I find it a poor use of an evening that might be spent being right about something." She set down her glass and walked for the door. Behind her, the silence had a particular shape. Not laughter, not quite embarrassment, but a small knot of people deciding which way to fall. She didn't turn to see which way it went. Louisa caught up with her on the stairs. "Do you know who that was?" "I can guess." Julian Calder, Duke of Rosemere, inherited at 26, never married, generally accounted the most eligible boor in 3 counties. Louisa glanced back toward the assembly room. "He's never said 2 unkind words to anyone in my hearing. I rather think you surprised it out of him." "Then he ought to learn to be surprised less rudely." "He ought," Louisa agreed, "though I'd wager good money he remembers tonight a great deal longer than you'd like him to." Catherine said nothing to that, mostly because she suspected Louisa was right, and she did not yet know what to do with the suspicion. Julian did not enjoy the carriage ride home. His sister Margaret had heard the whole story before he'd even handed her into the seat. Assemblies travelled gossip faster than horses travelled roads, and she was not inclined to let the matter rest. "Needlework," she repeated. "You said needlework to Catherine Pell in a room with half the harbour district listening. I wasn't entirely myself. She'd just corrected me in front of Norris. She'd just been right in front of Norris, which is a different offence entirely, and one you ought to have recognised." Margaret folded her hands. "Father always said the Pells had more sense between the 2 of them than half the gentlemen in this county put together. He'd have been ashamed of you tonight, Julian." "He never met the Pells." "He'd heard of them, everyone has." She looked at him steadily. "You're fortunate she didn't make more of it than she did. A lesser-tempered woman would have." Julian said nothing for the rest of the ride, turning the evening over privately, the way he turned over any matter that refused to settle. He told himself he would think no further on it by morning. He was wrong about that, though not for the reasons he expected. A letter from his solicitor was waiting on his desk when he came in, and the wax was still unbroken, the hour late for any ordinary correspondence. He knew before he'd even opened it that the evening's small humiliation was about to be outpaced by a considerably larger one. "It's not ruin," Julian said the next morning, standing at the window of his study with Whitlow's letter still in hand, and the man himself seated gravely across the desk. "Not ruin, Your Grace. Embarrassment, certainly, and a costly one." Mr. Whitlow had the particular gentleness of a man who had delivered worse news to better men than this one. "The Hampton holdings have lost 40% of their value since June, some £28,000 of the liquid capital Mr. Finch placed there on your behalf. And the second cargo, the one he advised you to hold rather than sell in the spring, clears customs in late October. If the market continues as it has, the penalty for late clearance could run past 12,000 more. £40,000 between the 2. Possibly more if the cargo runs past the month. None of it touches the entailed land, Your Grace. That's protected by the settlement, whatever else happens. But it touches everything else considerably. You'd be forced to mortgage the Hampton property outright, since it sits outside the entail and was bought with your grandmother's portion. Lady Margaret's marriage settlement is invested in the same speculation, and would need replenishing from somewhere. And I needn't tell you what it does to a man standing with his bankers to go to Coots twice in 1 year explaining a loss his own steward advised him into. Julian set the letter down. Outside, 200 years of colder land stretched toward a horizon that had always, until this moment, seemed entirely his. Land he now understood, with some bitterness, he had never truly been free to lose, and that the freedom to lose everything else had been quite enough on its own. What would you advise? Whitlow hesitated, which was answer enough before he spoke at all. Honestly, Your Grace, I'd advise someone who understands shipping markets better than either of us does. Mr. Finch is a fine steward. He is not a trader, and the distinction has cost you dearly this year. Anyone in particular you have in mind? There's a house in town, Pell's. The daughter runs it now, has done since the father died 6 years back. Sharpest read on shipping risk in this county, by every account I've heard, present company included. Whitlow's hesitation took a different shape this time, careful, almost apologetic. I wouldn't presume to know more than that, Your Grace. I only know that men ask to see her ledgers before they'll commit money anywhere near a harbour. Julian's jaw tightened before he'd fully placed the name. Then he placed it, and the room seemed to shrink by half. The woman from the assembly, he said. I couldn't say, Your Grace. I only know the firm. Julian said nothing. Rain had begun outside, fine and unhurried, the kind that didn't announce itself so much as arrive and stay. He did not go that day, nor the next. Pride, it turned out, was slower to spend than money. It took him 9 more days, 2 further letters from Whitlow growing steadily less gentle, and 1 conversation with Margaret over tea before he finally moved. You're going to mortgage Hampton and shame the family at Coots before you'll admit a woman was right about something, Margaret said, not looking up from her needlework, which struck him as an unkind irony he chose not to mention. I find that almost admirable, in a stupid sort of way. I called her a fool in front of 30 people, Margaret. I can hardly walk into her counting house and ask for her help as though that never happened. You can. You simply won't enjoy it. She set down her work, which is, I think, rather the point of having behaved badly in the first place. The discomfort is owed. He went the next morning. The counting house smelled of ink and tallow, and the particular brine that clung to anything close enough to the harbour to matter. Catherine was at her desk when the clerk announced him, and she heard the title before the name, His Grace the Duke of Rosemere, and did not look up at once because some satisfactions are worth a few seconds' delay. Miss Pell? His voice was careful in a way it hadn't been at the assembly. I wonder if I might have a few minutes of your time. Oh, you might. She set down her pen. Though I'm surprised to find you minding men's business in a house run by a woman who knits. A muscle moved in his jaw. Good, she thought. I deserved that, he said. You did. His glance went to the open ledger on her desk, columns of figures in a hand both small and exact, the kind that suggested everything in it had been checked twice. His expression changed, the way a man's face changes when a rumor becomes a fact directly in front of him. She closed the book before he could read more than the spine. I require advice, he said. On a shipping matter, I'm told you're the person to ask. You're told correctly. The question is whether you can bear to ask it. I'm asking it. Through gritted teeth, but yes. She gestured to the narrow chair across from her desk, the one she kept deliberately unwelcoming, for men who needed reminding whose house this was. Sit then, Your Grace, and tell me exactly how badly Mr. Finch has ruined you. He sat. For a long moment he said nothing, and she let the silence hold, having learned that men confessed faster in quiet rooms than loud ones. £40,000 between a bad speculation and a cargo that may yet be worse, he said at last. The cargo's the part still within my power to mend. It clears customs in October. If the market keeps falling and the penalty rates apply, I'll be forced to mortgage the one unentailed property I own outright, and explain to my bankers for the second time this year why my own steward's judgment cost me so dearly. Why hold it at all? Markets were already turning by July. Anyone reading the insurance notices could see that. You did, at the assembly. I did. She opened a fresh ledger, the working one, and dipped her pen without looking up. And you told me to take up needlework. I was wrong. You were rude. Those aren't always the same fault, though in your case I believe they were both true at once. She wrote a date at the top of the page. Bring me every letter Mr. Finch has sent you about this cargo since June. I want the actual figures, not his account of them. He returned 2 days later with a leather case full of correspondence, and she spent the better part of an hour reading through it, while he sat in the narrow chair, saying nothing, watching her face for some sign of the verdict before she gave it. "You're Mr. Finch," she said finally. "Writes like a man who has never once been wrong and cannot conceive of starting now." She held up a letter dated in July. "Here. He tells you to hold the cargo because, and I quote, 'the market always rewards patience.' That isn't advice. That's a man repeating something his own father told him and hoping the sea hasn't changed since. He's served my family nearly 30 years. My father first for more than 20 of them. Only me these last 7 since the funeral. Then he learned shipping under your father and chose comfort instead of correcting it once it fell to you. That's not loyalty, Your Grace. That's habit. Yours and his both, and it's costing you a great deal more than the 12,000 the cargo alone might lose." She set the letters down. "The cargo can likely still be saved, not easily. You'll need to act before it clears customs, not after, and you'll need to stop taking his counsel on anything to do with the sea, starting today. And if I bring you everything else, every figure, every account, then we'll know by November whether you're ruined or merely frightened." She looked at him directly. "Which would you rather I tell you when the time comes?" "The truth," he said, "whichever it turns out to be." It was, she thought afterward, the first genuinely sensible thing she had ever heard him say. He came back the following week, and the week after that until October found the counting house become, without either of them quite deciding it should, the place where the real business of saving his dukedom got done. "You always have that book," he said one afternoon, watching her flip to a marked page without searching for it. "6 years of every decision this house has made. I'd be a fool to leave it behind." She found the figure she wanted. "Your second cargo. The insurance is underwritten through Pemberton's now, correctly this time. Clear customs by the 14th, and you recover the loss in full. Clear after that, but before the 20th, and you'll still recover most of it, though not all. Past the 20th, the penalty rates apply, and whatever's left of the difference is gone outright. 6 days then between the best outcome and the worst. 6 days margin on a duke's entire autumn." She glanced up. "Does that frighten you?" "Yes," he said with a plainness that surprised them both. "Considerably." "Good. Frightened men listen better than confident ones. It's why you're finally any use to deal with." She closed the ledger, but didn't move her hand from its cover. "Your father, did he teach you any of this, or did he leave it all to Finch as well?" "He left it all to Finch. He used to say a duke directs and trusts and signs where he's told." Julian looked at the ledger under her hand rather than at her face. "I've begun to think that's a very comfortable way to ruin a family slowly." "It is," she said, "though I notice you've stopped signing where you're told. I've had a poor teacher and a good one this year, Miss Pell. I know the difference now." She did not have a clever answer to that, which she found privately somewhat alarming. The first real test of her counsel came not from the Marianne but from a smaller matter, a consignment of Spanish wool Julian had nearly let lapse, because Finch had once told him such things resolved themselves if a man simply waited. "You have until Thursday to confirm the contract," Catherine said, reading the notice he'd brought her. "After that, Pemberton's releases the wool to the next bidder, and you've lost it for nothing." Finch said, "Finch isn't here, Your Grace, and the wool won't wait on his opinion of it." She was already drafting a reply on a fresh sheet. "Sign this. Send it by your fastest rider today, not tomorrow." He signed without reading it twice, which she noted, and did not say aloud. Was the first time he had trusted her absolutely, rather than merely listened politely. The contract was confirmed by the following evening. It was a small sum against the scale of his troubles, £400 no more. But he came to tell her himself rather than send word by a clerk, and stood in her doorway looking, for once, genuinely pleased, rather than merely relieved. £400, he said. "It feels considerably larger than that. It's the first thing that's gone right for you all year that you didn't have to grieve over afterward. That tends to feel larger than the figure warrants." She found she was smiling and didn't trouble to stop herself. "Don't grow attached to the feeling, Your Grace. The Marianne is a different scale of risk entirely. I'm not complacent. I'm grateful, which I gather is a different fault. It is, a much more bearable one." She closed the ledger. "Go home. You look like a man who hasn't slept properly in some time." He went, and she sat a while after, aware of a lightness in the room that hadn't been there an hour before, and unwilling just yet to examine where it had come from. Thomas found her that evening going through correspondence by lamplight and dropped into the same chair the Duke had vacated an hour before. "He was here again," he said. Not a question. He was. "Catherine, the man insulted you in front of half the county not 2 months ago, and now he's here 3 days in 5. He is, and he does precisely as I tell him, which is rather more than I can say for you." She regretted it the moment she'd said it, but didn't take it back. Norris's offer still stands. It does, though I'll confess the Duke coming and going so often has the Norris family wondering whether we mean to sell at all, or whether you've found a grander use for this house than trade. Thomas's mouth twisted. "Some of the talk isn't unkind to us for once. I don't know what to make of that." "Make nothing of it. He needs a tradeswoman's arithmetic, not a wife, and I'd thank you not to imagine otherwise, to the Norrises or anyone else." "I imagine what I see, Catherine." He stood. "I won't push the sale again this month, but I won't wait past November either. Some of us would still like to be respectable before we're 40. He left before she could answer, which she suspected was entirely the point. 3 days later, a visitor arrived at Rosemere whom Julian had not summoned and did not, on seeing him in the hall, particularly wish to receive. "Your Grace." Aldous Finch had the easy, paternal smile of a man who had known this particular Duke since he was a small boy still in skirts, and had never quite stopped believing he could still be managed as one. "I'd heard you've taken to consulting a tradeswoman about the cargo. I thought I'd come and save you the trouble." "The trouble's rather the point, Finch. You cost me £12,000 advising me to hold it. The market turned against us. It happens to the soundest men in the city. It's not a fault of judgment, only of timing." Finch settled into a chair as though he owned it, which, Julian reflected, he had effectively been permitted to believe since before Julian's father had died. "I've a new plan that will recover the loss by spring, with men I trust, in a venture far steadier than anything a harbour merchant's daughter would dare advise." "She's advised me correctly so far." "She's advised you to distrust the one man who's never once failed your family before this year." Finch's voice softened, the way it always had when Julian was a boy in want of guidance. "I understand the appeal of a clever woman with a ledger, Your Grace, but trade people see profit, not consequence. They've no stake in what happens to Rosemere after the money's counted. I do." Julian said nothing for a moment, and in the silence felt, with some unease, the old pull of a voice he had trusted his whole life, and beneath it, quieter but more insistent, the memory of a narrow chair, a closed ledger, and a woman who had never once told him what he wanted to hear. "I'll consider it," he said. It was not agreement. It was not refusal either. And as Finch left satisfied, Julian understood that he had just failed a test he hadn't realized was being given, and that the cost of failing it properly later might be a great deal higher than the cargo alone. October came in grey and certain. The Mariana Pemberton's ship, carrying the whole of Rosemere's remaining hope, was due into port by the 14th, and every day that passed without word narrowed the 6 days' margin Catherine had named into something closer to 4, then 3. "You saw Finch," Catherine said the morning after his visit, not as a question. Whitlow had mentioned it, careful and apologetic, the way he mentioned most things that worried him. "I did." "And?" "And I told him I'd consider his plan." Julian met her eyes across the desk. "I haven't acted on it. I came here instead." "That's not the same as refusing him." "No," he admitted, "it isn't." She studied him a long moment, her hand resting on the ledger's spine the way it always did when a figure wouldn't settle. "I won't share counsel with a man who's keeping 2 advisers and hoping we never compare notes, Your Grace. I've seen what that costs people. It costs them everything eventually, and it's always the honest adviser who's let go first, because honesty is never the comfortable choice. I'm not keeping 2 advisers. You're keeping one and considering a second, which from where I sit looks very much the same." She closed the book. "Decide which voice you actually trust. Then come back and tell me plainly, so I know whether the hours I spend on your affairs are worth spending at all." He left without resolving it that day, which neither of them found satisfying. He came back 3 evenings later, later than he ever had before, the counting-house empty of clerks and lit only by the lamp at her desk. "I told Finch no," he said, before she'd even risen to greet him. "This afternoon, plainly as you asked." "What did he say?" "That I was making a sentimental error in trusting a tradeswoman over a man who'd known me since the cradle." Julian's mouth curved, faint and dry. "I told him sentiment had nothing to do with it. That you'd been right about the insurance, right about the rates, right about everything he'd been wrong about since June, and that a man ought eventually to notice such a pattern. The lamp between them threw a small, steady light. Catherine was conscious suddenly of how close he stood to the desk, of the rain beginning faintly against the window, of a silence that had gone on a beat longer than business required. "You came all this way at this hour to tell me that," she said. "I came because I didn't want you thinking, even for an evening, that I'd chosen comfort over correctness." He didn't move closer, but he didn't look away either. "I find I mind very much what you think of me now. I can't entirely say when that began. You called me a fool in a room full of people 2 months ago. I know precisely what I called you. I've had a great deal of time since to regret the exact words." His voice dropped, quieter, less certain than she had ever heard it. "I don't regret coming here, though. Whatever else I've got wrong this year, I don't regret that." Neither of them spoke for a moment that felt longer than it was. She did not step back. He did not step forward. It was, she thought, exactly the sort of silence the rules of her world existed to prevent, and exactly the sort she found she had no wish to end. "The Mariana's due within the week," she said at last low. "We ought to speak of nothing else until she's safely in." "Ought," he agreed, not moving. "Yes." He left a moment later, and neither of them had touched the ledger at all. Word travels fast in a town built around a harbour, and faster still when a duke is seen leaving a tradeswoman's counting house past dark 3 times in a fortnight. By the end of that week, Catherine could not walk to the customs office without feeling Mrs. Henley's gaze follow her the length of the street, and Louisa arrived at the house with an expression that was trying, not entirely successfully, to look unconcerned. "They're saying he means to make you his mistress," Louisa said, "or his Duchess, depending which version you hear. And which version you hear depends entirely on how much the speaker likes you. I've given them nothing to say either way. You've given them a duke at your door 3 nights running. That's quite enough material for Marlow Cross to build a cathedral of gossip on." Louisa softened. "I don't repeat it to wound you, Catherine. I repeat it because Thomas will hear it before the week's out, and I'd rather you heard it from me first." Thomas did hear it predictably within 2 days, and arrived at the counting house with Norris's letter already in hand. "The offer expires at month's end," he said, setting it on her desk without preamble. £11,000, and I mean to take it whether you agree or not, Catherine, because I won't have us made a joke of in every drawing room in the county while you wait to see whether a duke means to marry you, or merely use your arithmetic and forget you by Christmas. That isn't what's happening. Then tell me plainly what is, because I confess I can't see it from where I stand." He looked at her, and for once there was no mockery in it, only a brother's plain fear. "I don't want to sell out of spite. I want to sell because I'm frightened for you, and you won't say a word to reassure me otherwise." She had no ready answer, and the absence of one frightened her rather more than his ultimatum did. Lady Margaret Calder called the next afternoon, which surprised Catherine considerably more than Thomas's ultimatum had. She came without ceremony, in a plain carriage rather than the Rosemere crest, and accepted tea with the air of a woman who had decided in advance not to waste anyone's time. "I'll be direct, Miss Pell, since I gather directness is the coin you trade in." Margaret set down her cup. "My brother has spoken your name at supper more often this autumn than he's spoken of the harvest, the Parliament, or the state of the roof, and I've known him 30 years without once hearing him do that for any woman." "He's spoken of my ledgers, Lady Margaret. There's a difference." "Is there?" Margaret's look was not unkind, only frankly assessing. "I came to see whether you meant to be sensible about it, whatever it is. The whole county's talking, and talk has a way of deciding things before the people it concerns have made up their own minds." "I've made up nothing. There's a ship 4 days from port and a great deal riding on whether it arrives whole. I haven't the leisure to consider anything beyond that." "That's not a denial, Miss Pell." Margaret rose to go, then paused at the door. "For what it's worth, my father thought highly of yours. He used to say James Pell had more sense than half the men who looked down on him for using it. I'd be glad to see that sense kept in the family a while longer, in whatever shape it came." She left before Catherine could decide whether that had been an endorsement or simply an old woman's fondness for her father's memory, worn lightly by his daughter. Catherine sat with the thought longer than she meant to, and was still sitting with it when Hobbs announced the following morning that Mr. Finch had called. The blow, when it came from a different direction entirely. Finch, having failed with the Duke directly, called on Catherine that same morning, unannounced and entirely too pleasant. Miss Pell, I thought it past time we spoke, given how closely our interests have come to overlap this autumn. He did not sit when she did not offer the chair. I've advised the Calder family for 30 years. I should hate to see a misunderstanding between us cost his grace dearly, when a little plain speaking might prevent it. Speak plainly, then. The Marianne is due any day. Once she's safely cleared and the Duke's fortunes are mended, I imagine your usefulness to him concludes rather naturally. Finch's gaze moved briefly to the ledger on her desk, the way a man looks at a thing he intends to discredit. I'd advise you not to mistake gratitude for anything warmer, Miss Pell, nor to let your brother's firm suffer for a fancy that won't outlast the harvest. I say this as a kindness. Tradeswomen who forget their place tend to be reminded of it less gently by someone else. Is that a kindness, Mr. Finch, or a threat dressed in one? It's experience. I've watched men of rank grow fond of clever company before. The fondness rarely survives the first sensible match his mother proposes. He smiled again, unhurried. You're a capable woman. I'd hate to see capability mistaken for an understanding that was never truly offered. Catherine rose. You came here to frighten me into stepping back before the ship clears, so that if his fortunes fail, you're the only advisor left standing to blame me for it. That's not kindness, Mr. Finch. That's arithmetic, and I happen to be better at it than you. Then I hope, for the Duke's sake, you're as good at it as everyone claims. He inclined his head unbothered and let himself out without waiting to be shown the door. She had scarcely sat again when Hobbs returned, looking faintly puzzled. His Grace is here, Miss Pell. He passed Mr. Finch on the step. I don't think they spoke. Julian came in a moment later, and whatever he'd read in Finch's face on the way out had plainly unsettled him, because he didn't trouble with greeting before he asked it. What did he want? To tell me my usefulness to you ends with the Marianne, and that I'd do well to remember it. She kept her voice even, though it took effort to manage it. He's not entirely wrong to wonder, Your Grace. We've never once spoken of what happens after the ship clears, you and I, only of what happens before. Julian was quiet a moment, and in the quiet she watched him weigh his answer, the easy, practiced silence of a man deciding how much truth a room could bear. I hadn't thought past the ship, he admitted finally. I find standing here that I'd like to. She did not answer that at once, and the not answering said a good deal more than either of them was yet prepared to put into words. She sat alone after he'd gone, the ledger open before her, her hand pressed flat against the page, and found, for the first time since the assembly, since the narrow chair, since the rain against the window 3 nights past, that she was no longer entirely certain whether the thing she was guarding was the firm or her own heart, or whether by now there was any longer a difference between the two. The Marianne was 4 days from port, so unmistakably was everything else. By the 2nd week of October, the counting-house had become so regular a stop on Julian's days that Hobbs had taken to setting out a second inkstand without being asked. Catherine told herself this meant nothing beyond convenience. She did not entirely believe it, and was honest enough with herself in the privacy of her own ledger to admit as much. Norris asked after you at the harbour master's office, Julian said one afternoon, not quite looking up from the figures she'd set before him. Wanted to know whether the rumour of a duke's custom had improved trade or merely improved gossip. And what did you tell him? That I hadn't the faintest notion, since I came for arithmetic and had no opinion to offer on gossip. He glanced up then, and the dryness in his face didn't quite reach his eyes. It was a lie, of course. I have a great many opinions on the gossip. I've simply found I'd rather hear yours first. My opinion is that gossip is cheaper than information, and twice as loudly traded, and I'd thank you not to let either cost you a sound decision. She tapped the ledger. Your mortgage terms on Hampton are due for renewal within the fortnight, regardless of what Marlow Cross thinks of either of us. You always do that. Do what? Return the conversation to the figures the moment it strays somewhere less convenient for you. He said it without malice, almost fondly, and she found she had no ready answer for that either, which was becoming, she privately admitted, something of a pattern. It was into that particular quiet that Whitlow arrived 3 days later, hat in hand, having come straight from the harbour master's office, with news that would make every conversation since seem, in hindsight, like the calm before a much larger reckoning. The Marianne did not arrive on the 14th, nor the 15th, and by the 16th a different kind of talk had begun moving through Marlow Cross, quieter than the gossip about a duke at a tradeswoman's door, and considerably more frightening, because it concerned weather rather than reputation. There was a gale off the Lizard a week past, Whitlow said, standing in the counting-house doorway with his hat still in hand, having come straight from the harbour-master's office. 2 ships out of Bristol put in at Falmouth for repairs. No word yet whether the Marianne was among them. Catherine kept her voice level, for Julian's sake more than her own. No word isn't the same as bad news, Mr. Whitlow. No, but it isn't good news either, and His Grace has had precious little of that this year. Whitlow glanced toward Julian, who stood very still by the window, the way a man stands when stillness is the only thing keeping him upright. I thought you ought to hear it from me before you heard it from the street. He left them with that, and the counting-house held a silence neither of them moved to fill. If she's lost, Julian said finally, I'm forced to mortgage Hampton outright and very likely ask Margaret to wait another year for her settlement besides. If she's lost, we'll find another way. Catherine closed the ledger she'd been working from, though she did not let go of it. You're not the first man to nearly ruin himself on bad counsel, Your Grace. You'd merely be the first I've helped recover from it. I don't intend to let that distinction go to waste over one storm. You say we now. I say it because it's true and I've stopped pretending otherwise, which I gather is rather the point of everything that's happened since September. She met his eyes. Don't make more of it than the moment can bear. There's still a ship unaccounted for. I'm not making more of it. I'm only noticing it. His mouth curved, faint, the same dry edge she'd first disliked in him and had since come, despite every intention to the contrary, to find rather dear. It's a fault of mine. Noticing things several weeks after I ought to have. She did not sleep well that night, nor the one after, though she told no one so directly. Thomas noticed regardless. He had always been better at reading her than she gave him credit for when he troubled to look. You're worried about the ship, he said, finding her at the desk past midnight. The ledger opened to figures she'd already checked twice. I'm worried about a great many people who'll suffer if she's lost. His tenants, his sister, the men who crewed her. She did not look up. I'm not in the habit of pretending my interest is purely professional, Thomas, if that's what you've come to ask. It wasn't, but I'm glad to have it confirmed regardless. He set a cup of tea at her elbow, the closest thing to tenderness he generally permitted himself. For what it's worth, I don't think you've miscalculated him. I thought I would when this started. I don't any longer. That's the nearest thing to a blessing I've had from you all year. Don't grow used to it. I intend to be insufferable about it later, once we're certain there's a later worth being insufferable in. He left her to the ledger, and she sat with it a long while, her hand resting on its spine, willing a ship she could not see to find its way safely home. Finch came that same afternoon, before word of the storm had even fully settled into rumour, and this time he did not trouble with pleasantries. I heard about the Marianne, he said, finding Julian in the estate library rather than waiting to be received. I'd hoped it wouldn't come to this, Your Grace, but I think you'll agree now that the Harbour Merchants' Council, however clever, was never equal to 30 years of my experience. I've a buyer for Hampton already lined up, should the worst be confirmed. A discreet sale of the unentailed land? Nothing the wider family need ever hear of. No one need know the dukedom was ever in difficulty. You're offering to sell my land before I know whether I need to. I'm offering to spare you the indignity of waiting to find out in public. Finch's tone had lost its paternal warmth. What remained was plain impatience. Miss Pell gave you sound figures, I don't doubt it, but figures don't sail ships through a gale, Your Grace. And when the sea takes what it takes, a man wants someone who can act, not someone who can only calculate afterward what was lost. Julian was quiet a moment. Then he said with a calm that surprised even him, You came to my father's funeral and told me a duke directs and trusts and signs where he's told. I believed you for 7 years. I've spent the last 2 months learning precisely how much that belief cost me. I never once acted against your interest, Your Grace. You acted on the assumption that your interest and mine were the same thing, which isn't quite the same as never acting against me, and I think you know that, or you wouldn't be here today trying to sell my land before the news has even been confirmed. Julian rose. I won't be selling anything until I have word from Falmouth myself, and I won't be discussing it further with you, Finch. Not today, and I think not after today either. Finch's face shifted through wounded, then proud, then carefully blank, the look of a man recalculating 30 years of certainty in the space of a single sentence. You're choosing her over me. I'm choosing the truth over comfort. You taught me that distinction yourself without meaning to. Julian's voice didn't rise. "I'd thank you to see yourself out." Word came 2 days later, not from Whitlow but from Hobbs, who arrived at the counting house breathless and grinning in a way junior clerks rarely permitted themselves. "She's in, Miss Pell. The Marianne. Put in at Falmouth during the gale, exactly as they feared, but the cargo's whole. She's cleared customs there and is due into our own harbour within 2 days, ahead of the deadline after all." Catherine sat very still for a moment. The tightness she'd been carrying in her chest for a week finally let go. Then she rose, took her cloak from the hook by the door, and walked the length of the harbour road to Rosemere herself, ledger in hand, rather than sending word by anyone else. The footman who answered the door knew her well enough by now not to question it, and showed her directly to the library, where Julian was already on his feet before she'd crossed the threshold. He knew from her face, before she'd said a single word, exactly what she'd come to tell him. The footman withdrew to the hall, the door left properly ajar behind him. "She's safe," Julian said. "Not quite a question. She's safe. Whole cargo cleared at Falmouth, due into our own port within 2 days." Catherine held the ledger against her, a habit she hadn't troubled to break. "Past the 14th, so you won't recover the loss in full, but well before the 20th, which means most of it, and the difference left over is one you can bear." He crossed the room and took her hand briefly, properly. The kind of touch a man permits himself when a footman stands within easy call beyond an open door. "I owe you considerably more than I can mortgage Hampton to repay," he said. "You owe me an honest accounting, which is all I've ever asked of you." She did not draw her hand back at once. "Don't let gratitude make you say something foolish you'll regret by Christmas, Your Grace." "I'm not grateful," he said. "Or I am, but that isn't what this is." He released her hand, though he didn't step back. "I came to you in September because I had no other choice left. I've come back every week since for a reason that had considerably less to do with arithmetic than either of us was willing to say aloud." Julian. His name, unadorned, no title attached, came out of her before she'd decided to use it. "Catherine," he said it back the same way, as though testing how it sat between them. "I've a confession to make, and I find I'd rather make it properly than let it wait for a more convenient evening." "Say it plainly then," she said. "You know I've no patience for anything less. I love you. I have for some weeks now, longer perhaps than I've been willing to admit even to myself." He did not look away from her as he said it, though the admission plainly unsettled him. "I called you a fool in a room full of people because I was startled to find a woman cleverer than I was, and too proud to say so plainly. I've spent 2 months learning what an expensive kind of pride that was, in every sense of the word. You've apologized for that already." "I apologized for the words. I haven't yet apologized for what they cost you. Not in feeling, but in standing. Every soul in this town heard a duke dismiss you as unfit to mind men's business, and not one of them has heard me say, plainly and in public, exactly how wrong I was." His voice was steady, though quieter than usual. "I mean to put that right before I ask you anything else of you, Catherine. You deserve the correction owed publicly, not merely privately in a library with the door ajar." She studied him, searching, she thought, for the particular vanity that so often hid inside a grand gesture, and found instead only the plain discomfort of a proud man preparing to be humbled on purpose in front of people whose good opinion he had spent his whole life courting, without ever once questioning whether he deserved it. "All right," she said. "Where and when?" "The Autumn Assembly, the Customs Hall, 3 nights from now. The same room, I think, deserves to hear the correction it heard the offence in." The Customs Hall held nearly the whole of Marlow Cross that night, drawn by rumour of the Marianne's safe return, and, Catherine suspected, by a fair measure of curiosity about exactly what a duke and a tradeswoman had been doing in each other's company 3 nights a week since September. Thomas stood near the punch bowl looking faintly ill at ease. Louisa stood near Catherine, looking entirely too pleased with herself. "He asked you to come tonight specifically," Louisa murmured. "That's not nothing, Catherine. It's an apology. I haven't decided yet what else it is." "You've decided. You're only pretending you haven't, because deciding feels safer with one foot still outside the door." Louisa squeezed her hand once and said nothing further, which was, for Louisa, an uncommon act of restraint. Julian crossed the room when the musicians paused, and the room's attention swung to him the same way it had in September, but this time he did not wait for anyone else to speak first. "Some of you will remember an evening in this room 2 months ago," he said, his voice pitched to carry without straining for it. when I told Miss Pell she ought to be home with her needlework rather than minding men's business. I said it because she had corrected me accurately, in front of men whose good opinion I valued more than I valued being right. It was a poor excuse for unkindness, and I've had 2 months to consider exactly how poor. Norris near the wine table had the grace to look uncomfortable. Mrs. Henley's fan went still. Miss Pell's counsel saved the Rosemere estate this autumn, after my own steward's advice very nearly ruined it, Julian continued. Every figure she gave me was sound. Every instinct I doubted in her has since proven correct, and every instinct of mine that doubted her was nothing more than pride dressed up as judgment. I owe her an apology considerably larger than the one I gave her privately, and I find I'd rather make it here, in the room where the harm was done, than anywhere more comfortable for myself. He turned to her directly, and the room, sensing it had strayed somewhere it hadn't quite been invited, went very quiet. Miss Pell, I was wrong about you in every particular I could be wrong, and I am considerably better, and considerably better off for having been corrected. His voice dropped just slightly, though every word still carried. I don't know that Marlow Cross has ever owed an apology to anyone so thoroughly as it owes one to you. I'm glad to be the one paying the first part of that debt tonight. You were wrong, she agreed with the composure of a woman who had waited 2 months to say so in front of witnesses. Thoroughly. I'll expect the county to remember it. I rather think it will. He inclined his head to her, correct and formal, the bow of a man closing a matter of honor rather than opening one of the heart, and the room exhaled, satisfied, into its ordinary business once more. The musicians took up again. Norris, looking as though he'd swallowed something disagreeable, found urgent reason to refill his glass. Louisa appeared at Catherine's elbow within the minute, glowing with the particular delight of a woman who has just watched a debt repaid in full view of everyone who'd witnessed it owed. Well, that was considerably more than I expected, and considerably less than I suspect is coming. I haven't the faintest notion what you mean. You haven't the faintest notion how to lie convincingly is what you haven't. It's one of the few things you do badly. Louisa squeezed her hand and let the subject drop, for the moment, which was as much mercy as Catherine could reasonably expect from her. He found her a quarter-hour later on the narrow terrace behind the customs hall, where she had stepped out for air and the relief of not being watched, and where the only light came from the assembly windows behind them, and the only company, at a discreet distance inside the open doorway, was Louisa, who had followed her out and showed no particular inclination to follow her any further. You said it carefully in there, Catherine said. Every word chosen, I noticed. I'd had 2 months to choose them. Julian came to stand beside her at the rail, close enough to speak quietly and be heard, no closer. I said what the room was owed. I didn't say what you're owed because I wasn't willing to hand you to Marlow Cross to discuss over breakfast tomorrow. And what am I owed? The truth plainly, the way you've always insisted on having it. He turned to face her properly. I love you. I have for some weeks now, longer perhaps than I've been willing to admit, even to myself. I called you a fool in that room because I was startled to find a woman cleverer than I was, and too proud to say so. I've spent 2 months learning what an expensive kind of pride that was, in every sense of the word. Catherine was glad for once of the dark, and of the narrow distance between the terrace and the windows, and of Louisa's tactful refusal to come any closer. You might have said that in there as well. I might have. I'd rather you didn't belong to a room full of strangers the first time you heard it. His voice had dropped, quieter, less certain than she had ever heard it. I'd rather you belonged only to yourself, hearing it, and decide afterward what you wish to do with it. That's a very careful kind of declaration, Your Grace. I've had a great deal of practice this autumn at being careful. I find I'd like very much to stop being careful with you specifically. He reached for her hand, and this time neither of them pretended it was anything but what it was. Tell me to stop, if I've read this wrong. She did not tell him to stop. She lifted her face instead, and he bent his head to hers and kissed her briefly and without performance, the kind of kiss that asked a question rather than declaring an answer, screened from the room by nothing more than a few feet of darkness, and Louisa's deliberately turned back. Yes, she said when he drew back, in case that wasn't clear enough already. Thomas found her in the carriage afterward, having claimed the seat beside her before Julian could. You came back from that terrace looking entirely too pleased with yourself, he said. I don't believe for a moment it was only the night air. I didn't know myself until an hour ago. I'm not in the habit of arranging my own ambushes. Norris's offer expires at month's end. Thomas turned the same paperweight he always carried, the worn one from the counting house he'd taken to slipping into his pocket on important evenings, as though it might bring him luck. I think I'll let it expire unanswered, if it's all the same to you. A firm that can save a dukedom hardly wants selling to the Norrises for £11,000. You're getting ahead of things, Thomas. Nothing's settled. I'm aware. I'm choosing to take some credit regardless. He almost smiled. Father would have liked tonight. Not the Duke particularly. Father never had much patience for rank, but the part where you proved every one of them wrong without raising your voice once. That part he'd have liked considerably. Julian called the following morning, properly this time, with Margaret as chaperone, and a small velvet box he handled with considerably less confidence than he'd handled the entire dukedom's worth of figures over the past 2 months. I'd meant to do this with more ceremony, he admitted, in the same sunlit corner of the counting house where he'd first sat in the narrow chair, mortified, asking for her help. A proper proposal. Flowers. Something composed in advance, instead of whatever I'm about to say now. I rather think I prefer whatever you're about to say now. I've grown suspicious of anything you compose too carefully in advance. She set down her pen, the old habit, though her hands were not quite steady doing it. Say it plainly, Julian. You know I've no patience for anything less. Marry me. Not because you saved Rosemere, though you did, and not because I find I can no longer sit in this chair without wanting to stay considerably longer than business requires. Marry me because you are the one person who has ever told me the truth without softening it for my comfort, and I find I cannot imagine living the rest of my life without that particular honesty in it. She looked at the ring he held, then at him, and found she had for once nothing clever to say at all. Yes, she said simply, though I'd warn you of one condition before you call it settled. The firm doesn't end the day I marry you. I won't have it said I traded the Pell name for a title and let the business die quietly behind me. I'd never ask that of you. I've thought on it already, in fact, which I'll admit surprised me as much as it may surprise you. Julian's voice steadied as he found firmer ground. The law would make the firm mine, the moment we married, whatever either of us wished otherwise. Whitlow's explained it to me at length, and not gently. But a proper settlement, drawn up before the wedding and placed in trust, can keep it out of my hands entirely, held for your sole and separate use, with trustees who answer to no one but you. Thomas, if you'll have him. Whitlow alongside, if you'd like a second name on the deed who isn't family. You've already spoken to Whitlow about this. I spoke to him the morning after I decided to ask you, before I'd worked up the nerve to do either properly. He slid the ring onto her finger. I won't pretend the law is kind to you in this, Catherine. It isn't, and no settlement changes that entirely. But I can at least see to it that no one, myself included, ever has the power to take the firm from you by right of marrying you. That much is within my gift, and I mean to give it. That's not the afterthought of a man who only thought of the ledger to please me. No, he agreed. It rather kept me up several nights, if you'd like the truth of it. I noticed something had. She studied the ring a moment. Plain, well-made, the sort of thing chosen by a man who'd learned finally to value substance over display. Thomas will be unbearable about this for a decade at least. Then we're well matched in that particular suffering. Margaret's been unbearable about it since September. They married in December, in the small stone church at Rosemere rather than in town, which suited them both. Catherine had no patience for spectacle, and Julian had developed, over the autumn, a considerable distaste for rooms full of people watching him. Margaret stood as witness on his side. Louisa stood as witness on Catherine's, and cried more than either of the principals, which she considered entirely appropriate to her role. Catherine wore her mother's pearls and carried, tucked discreetly into the folds of her gown where only Louisa noticed it, a single folded page torn from an old ledger, the very first page her father had ever entered a figure into, kept all these years for no reason she could have explained aloud, and every reason that mattered to her privately. "You're not nervous," Louisa whispered, adjusting the pearls a final time before the church doors opened. "I've negotiated harder bargains than this one. I merely happen to like the terms considerably better." The vicar, an elderly man who had known the Calder family 3 generations, and the Pell family not at all until that winter, remarked afterward to anyone who'd listen that he had never married a couple who looked less anxious and more thoroughly amused by the entire proceeding. which he meant and which Catherine took as the highest possible compliment. "Your Grace," Julian said to her quietly, as they walked back up the aisle together, testing the title on her the way she'd once tested his on him in a counting house months before. "I shall have to grow accustomed to that." "You'll grow accustomed to it the way you grow accustomed to everything else, Catherine. Thoroughly and rather faster than anyone gives you credit for." He glanced down at her, the dry edge back in his face, though warmer now than it had ever been at that first assembly. "I find I've stopped being surprised by how quickly you master things. I ought to have stopped being surprised by it in September." "You ought. I shan't hold it against you forever, only for another decade or two." The match raised eyebrows in exactly the modest way Catherine had expected, and no further. A duke marrying a baronet's granddaughter, however much trade sat in her immediate history, was an unremarkable enough arrangement that the wider gentry found little to object to beyond the usual murmured commentary about money, and what little there was of that turned, within a season, into grudging admiration instead, once it became generally known that the new Duchess had saved the dukedom before she'd ever been asked to share its name. Thomas stayed on at the firm. He took to telling the story of the assembly, the needlework remark, the public retraction, the look on Norris's face when he realized exactly who'd been right all along, at every dinner where he judged the company would appreciate it, embellishing some detail or other each time, until Catherine gave up correcting him and let him have his version. He never raised the matter of selling again. Aldous Finch retired to a cottage in Kent the following spring, on a settlement Julian insisted upon, despite Catherine's mild objection that the man had very nearly ruined them. "He taught me badly," Julian said, the morning he rode out to see Finch off properly, rather than simply sending the settlement by letter. "But he taught me for 30 years, and I find I can't quite charge a man for the whole of his failing, when some of it was mine for never once questioning him sooner." Finch received him stiffly, in a parlour half-packed for the move, and did not sit when Julian did. "I didn't expect you to come yourself, Your Grace." "I came because 30 years deserves better than a letter, whatever else has passed between us since." Julian set the settlement papers on the table between them. "I don't forgive easily, Finch. I've learned that much about myself this year. But I find I'd rather end this honestly than end it bitterly, and I'd like to think you'd have wanted the same in my position." Finch studied the papers a long moment, then him. "She made you harder to manage. I'll say that for Miss Pell, for the Duchess, I should say now." A flicker of the old paternal warmth crossed his face briefly, before it settled into something more honest. "I think, in the end, that's what you needed rather more than you needed agreeable counsel. I simply wasn't the one able to give it to you." "No," Julian agreed, "you weren't." They shook hands at the door, which was, Julian reflected on the ride home, very nearly an apology, from a man who had likely never offered one outright in his life, and as close to peace as either of them was going to manage. Finch wrote once more the following Christmas, a short and stiffly worded note wishing them well. Catherine kept it, out of a sense that even imperfect endings deserved some record. 5 years on, the ledger still sat on Catherine's desk most mornings, though the desk itself had moved from the counting house to a sunlit room at Rosemere that Julian had built for her without asking, the year their first daughter was born, because he'd noticed, rather later than he ought to have by his own admission, that a woman who ran 2 households' worth of figures deserved a proper room to do it in. Margaret visited often, generally with opinions about the nursery, and a fondness for the children that surprised no one more than herself. "I never thought I'd be glad to be wrong that first autumn," she told Catherine once, watching her young nephew attempt with great seriousness to add figures in a discarded corner of the ledger, using a method entirely his own invention. "I thought Julian had lost his sense entirely. I'm rather glad now that he had the good fortune to lose it in your direction specifically." Thomas brought the firm's quarterly figures himself each season, rather than sending a clerk, partly from habit and partly, Catherine suspected, because he liked the excuse to see his nephew and niece, and liked even better the chance to remind anyone within earshot that the Pell trading house had once saved a dukedom, a fact he had never once tired of repeating in 5 years and showed no sign of tiring of in the 5 to come. He had taken to the trustee's role with more seriousness than Catherine had expected of him, and signed nothing on the firm's behalf without first walking the figures past her, though the law would have permitted him to do otherwise. "Norris asked after the firm again last month," Thomas mentioned on one such visit, with the particular satisfaction of a man delivering news he'd been saving. Wondered whether we might still consider selling now that things have settled so comfortably. And what did you tell him? That the Pell name on the door means rather more than it used to, and that the trustee answers to his sister before he answers to anyone's offer, however comfortable. Thomas accepted a cup of tea from the Duchess herself, which he still found, after 5 years, faintly amusing to receive. Father would have enjoyed watching you say no to that family quite as much as I have. You're at it again, Julian said, finding her there on a particular morning, their son asleep against his shoulder and their daughter trailing a wooden boat across the floorboards with the serious concentration of a girl convinced she was conducting important business. The harvest figures won't tally themselves, Your Grace. I've told you, you needn't call me that in my own house. I call you that precisely because we're in your own house. It amuses me. She closed the ledger, the old habit still intact, her hand resting on its spine a moment before she set it aside entirely. Besides, Thomas holds the title to the firm, on paper, same as the settlement says he must. I merely happen to be the one he asks before he decides anything at all. There's a great deal of comfort in that particular fiction, once you've made peace with it. I don't need peace with it. I helped arrange it. Julian crossed to the window, their son stirring faintly against him, and looked out at land that had nearly slipped through his hands one autumn, years before, and had stayed entirely his ever since, his and hers, and now, in the small determined shape crossing the floor with her wooden boat, theirs together. "Mama," their daughter announced, holding up the boat with great solemnity, "it has cleared customs." "Has it?" Catherine said, biting back a smile. "And what's the cargo?" "Everything," the girl said, as though this should have been obvious, and went back to her important business, while her parents exchanged a look that needed, by now, no further translation at all.
Don't forget to like and subscribe, or at least leave a comment if you enjoyed the story.